Good afternoon from Stockholm, Excellencies, ministers and representatives of the 5 Nordic governments, representatives of international human rights organizations, and representatives of international civil society. Dear audience, dear all, a warm welcome to this afternoon's discussion on the perspectives of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law under the COVID-19 pandemic. This discussion takes place in the run-up to International Democracy Day that falls on Tuesday, 15th of September. My name is Annika Ben-David. I hold the function of Ambassador at Large for Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs here in Stockholm, and I have the pleasure to moderate this meeting. With us on the screen are from Denmark, Minister for Development Cooperation Rasmus Prehn, from Finland, Minister for Foreign Affairs Pekka Haavisto, from Iceland, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Development Cooperation Gudlaugur Thor Thordarson, and from Norway, State Secretary for Foreign Affairs Marianne Hagen. We are delighted to have with us the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, Maria Pejcinovic-Buric, also the European Union's Special Representative on Human Rights, Eamon Gilmore. We have First Deputy Director of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, Katarzyna Gardawchadze, the United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, will address us through a video message, and so will the UNESCO's Director General, Audrey Azoulay. From international civil society, we are honored to have Ken Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, and Nils Muizhnieks, Europe Director at Amnesty International, and formerly Human Rights Commissioner at the Council of Europe, representing international civil society and human rights defenders. And last but not least, we are happy to hold this meeting in public through a live broadcast, and we wish our audience a warm welcome. I encourage you all to send in questions and comments to the dedicated email address that we have advertised, Drive for Democracy in one word, at gov.se. My colleague Johan Hallenborg is prepared to receive your questions. Now, the premise of this meeting is that the corona crisis must not be a vacuum for further global democratic backsliding with possible lasting effects. One last practical comment before we start. As a moderator, I will take the liberty of cutting interventions that exceed the allotted time, and I thank you in advance for your cooperation. With that, I have the honor to introduce my Minister for Foreign Affairs, Ann Linde, in order for her to open the meeting. Madam Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Annika. Distinguished colleagues, dear guests, and all of you who are watching. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased to host this meeting. I'm honored by the presence of Nordic colleagues, but also by senior representatives from the most important international organization working on human rights and democracy, including leading international civil society organizations. Also, I'm pleased that this meeting is open to the public. Welcome. The background of this meeting is well known. Democratic backsliding and questioning of principle are a trend we have witnessed for several years. Human rights norms are questioned and the rule of law is disrespected. The trends may be further worsened in the current challenging circumstances. In other words, it is a concern when response measures of the pandemic add to the fire. The pandemic itself negatively affects already marginalized individuals. And some governments take advantage of the situation of the pandemic as a pretext to violate human rights, tighten the democratic space, and redraw the global playing field. States are allowed by international law to restrict human rights under certain circumstances. However, any such restrictions must be strictly in line with international law and must meet the requirements of legality, necessity, and proportionality, and be non-discriminatory. My colleague, Minister for International Development Cooperation, Peter Eriksson, and I started a conversation this April with human rights representatives from international organizations and from civil society organizations to discuss the democracy, human rights, and rule of law developments during the pandemic. Our aim is to contribute to the global debate, but also to step forward and put words and action behind our foreign policy initiative, the Drive for Democracy. It was last year that my government decided to step up the promotion and support for democracy, its institutions and voice bearers through the Drive for Democracy. It aims to further strengthen our support for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law worldwide. Some of you here today has already taken part in the previous meetings. From these, I observed that the corona crisis has sharpened threats to human rights. The trends of democratic backsliding and undermining of the rule of law run a clear risk of being further worsened. The working environment for civil society organizations and human rights defenders have deteriorated with limited democratic space, and independent media is at risk in many places. More than 40 countries have introduced restrictions to freedom of expression, and close to 150 governments have introduced illegitimate limits to the freedom of association and assembly. This means civil society's space has been further tightened. And the pandemic is used as a pretext to unduly restrict or violate human rights and expand the executive power at the expense of democratic institutions. The freedom of the media and independent journalism is under threat. We know that in time of crisis, media and journalists are among the first casualties. We need to make sure journalists can do their job, informing the public and holding leaders to account. Disinformation has surged. The pandemic is given yet new example of how divisive and dangerous it is. A free and healthy independent media is the best cure for this. In many places, the pandemic has hit and is hitting the hardest on women and girls. At this point in time, it is more important than ever for us to support these actors that are such a vital part of society that works. A society with checks and balances and with a social contract. They make up the cornerstone of democracy. In a democratic society, political parties play a fundamental role. We will continue to support pluralistic political systems with political parties. We must also strengthen democratic political institutions and processes. Support towards institution building and capacity development in general is an important part of building a more and just democratic society. Strong institutions lead to better adherence to the rule of law. If we broaden the perspective even further, one cannot look beyond the stark and almost overwhelming impact on the pandemic of the global development. 500 million people are being at risk of being thrown back into poverty as a result of the pandemic. Significant attention and resources have been put to support to the health sector. But the challenges as a result of the pandemic are enormous. In particular, I think of education and the situation of women and girls. We are particularly concerned that funding for development cooperation risks decreasing as a result of the economic downturn. It is worrisome that donors move away from core funding or organizations into earmark support. We need to give more flexibility, not less, to enable these key actors to be able to adapt in challenging and rapidly changing context. Also, we need to make sure that support to democracy and human rights increase. Only then can we be serious about wanting to contribute to putting human rights at the core of our response. There must be no hesitation in our commitment. Among the 5 Nordic countries, we have started a collaboration to build back better and greener in the wake of the pandemic. As 5 mature democracies, building back better also means to do it from the right-based approach, with a view to strengthen democracy, human rights and the rule of law. This is something we look forward to. Dear colleagues, participants, let me conclude by saying that today the 5 Nordic countries have published an op-ed with a joint message. We want to make sure that human rights, democracy, the rule of law and gender equality are at the center of the immediate and long-term global response. In our article, we raise 4 aspects and points for action. We must mobilize internationally. The pandemic is a human crisis that is fast becoming a human rights crisis. To prevent this, we need to mobilize international support and emphasize that all measures taken to address the pandemic put human rights and the rule of law at the core of the response. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, and the right to unionize cannot be challenged with the pandemic as an excuse. We must ensure transparency and access to reliable information. Voices of independent media and civil society, including human rights defenders, must be protected and promoted. Their monitoring and reporting will contribute to holding governments accountable. We must ensure a gender perspective in the global response. Sweden has a feminist foreign policy, so this issue is central to us. In many ways, women and girls are suffering more than men during the pandemic. For example, we see increased level of sexual and gender-based violence. Women represent 70% of the health and social sector workforce globally, and too many women work with precarious conditions, thus risk being worse affected by the pandemic. The full enjoyment of sexual and reproductive health and rights, such as modern contraceptive, safe and legal abortion, and comprehensive sexuality education, has worsened considerably. Last but not least, we must ensure that international standards and principles are not diluted or changed. Any action to combat COVID-19 must not undermine international law or democracy. I hope that these points can serve as a starting point for our discussion today on how we can work together on these important issues. In the Nordic countries, we have experience in building people's trust in democratic institutions through accountability, transparent governance, free media, a vibrant civil society, and the rule of law. We are not perfect, but stand firm in our belief that strong democratic structures are necessary to withstand the range of challenges faced by this pandemic. Therefore, I believe we have something to offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. And with that, I turn to Copenhagen. Minister Prehn, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Annika. The rights of democracy are not reserved for a select group within society. They are the rights of all the people. As former Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme said, of course, Palme was absolutely right. Today, as we face COVID-19, it is as important as ever to stand up for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, for equality in solidarity. COVID-19 amplifies the pressure on human rights, democracy, civic space, rule of law, and good governance. People in vulnerable situations are hit hardest by the crisis when it comes to health, but also when it comes to socio-economic consequences and human rights. Women and girls, religious and ethnic minorities, indigenous people, civil society, and human rights defenders feel it very directly. Already before COVID-19, negative trends on human rights and democracy gave reasons for concern. Violation on individual rights and restriction of civil liberties, democratic backsliding with weakening of checks and balances, shrinking space for civil society, and persecution of human rights defenders. In great challenges lie great opportunities. We can fight the pandemics as we fight inequality and injustice. We can build back better and greener. People must have their rights protected. They must have access to information, access to sounding their voice, possibilities to participate. Governments must be transparent and accountable. This is vital for the social contract. This is what a sustainable response and rebuilding must be based on. Women and girls' rights and gender equality in politics is crucial, also for COVID-19 response and recovery. The rights of women and girls must be protected, and women must be included in society, equal to men. It is the right and the smart thing to do. International collaboration is key to overcome cross-border challenges. Imagine a COVID-19 crisis without the WHO, without a strong voice from the UN Secretary General putting human rights at the heart of the response and recovery effort. The UN has shown its central role. We must all work together, stay on track. In Denmark, we are ready to do our part, to use our voice, to act in solidarity. Denmark has always, and from the day one of the COVID-19 crisis, emphasized the importance of human rights, democracy, good governance, the rule of law, and gender equality. We have provided targeted support to access to sexual and reproductive health and rights, and we have had a particular focus on civil society and civic space. We are considering our next step in the COVID-19 response and recovery. We must act with principled resolve and human rights and democracy at the core. Our universal values must be dismantled. They are fundamental, must not be dismantled. They are fundamental in the struggle against COVID-19, against inequality, to build back better and greener, leaving no one behind. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister. And with that, I turn to Helsinki. Minister Haavisto, please. Varsågod.
Thank you. Tack ska du ha, dear friends and colleagues. Let me start by thanking our Swedish neighbors, particularly Minister Ann Linden and Minister Peter Eriksson, for organizing this important event. Our joint Nordic op-ed on today's theme will be published tomorrow also here in Finland. I'm pleased to see that we have a wide range of political, legal and human rights expertise present today on our virtual table. I would like to concentrate on 3 issues that I think are key to addressing successfully the pandemic and the response to it. My first point: human rights, democracy and the rule of law are always put into a test in times of crisis and catastrophes. Misuse of power and efforts to curtail basic rights of citizens can appear when an outside crisis forces governments to consider exceptional measures. Unfortunately, we have witnessed signs of this in some countries during the last months. We must not close our eyes on those attempts. My second point: While everyone is affected by the threat of the virus, the impacts of the global pandemic lay heavier specifically on women and girls. Women are paying the price with their economy, health, even sometimes with their lives. We have seen reports about increasing domestic and gender-based violence globally. Sexual and reproductive health are rights, and rights are also increasingly affected by the prolonged situation. In a particularly vulnerable situation are women and girls with disabilities. Also, indigenous women and women belonging to sexual or gender minorities are facing increasing discrimination. We must make sure that these people are now included in the decision making when we are jointly finding exit strategies from this crisis. And finally, we are never going to succeed if we are not working closely with the whole of society and those who protect it. Here I refer especially to the civil society and human rights defenders. You are our partners and witnesses on the ground. You are also the experts regarding responses to events. Support to the civil society has been absolutely key to Finland in its domestic and foreign policy approaches for a long time, and we remain stout defenders of this cooperation worldwide. Non-governmental organizations are our key partners also in the global fight against COVID-19. Our NGO partners have adjusted their annual programs to respond suitably to pandemic needs. All in all, Finland has now reallocated 4.3 million euros of NGO funding to the pandemic response. We should not forget that during crisis, NGOs play a key role supporting local community resilience. This is now needed more than ever in many places. And to the end, I would like to end with a question. How do we foresee and prepare for the societal problems that arise from a prolonged pandemic? Issues such as increasing economic inequality will certainly exacerbate existing societal tensions. We might end up seeing countries where only the rich can afford vaccines and treatment, while everyone else is left to survive themselves. This is not the world we want to see, and this we cannot afford. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I turn to Reykjavik and Minister Thordarson, please.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and allow me to thank Ann Linde and Sweden for arranging this discussion today on human rights in the time of COVID, but also more broadly for embarking on your drive for democracy. You can rest assured that you have Iceland's support going forward. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights clearly stipulates that we are all, every one of us, entitled to certain rights and freedoms, regardless of our race or color or sex or religion or our place of birth. This was true prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's true today. Unfortunately, there have always been those that violate these rights, seek to strip their fellow human beings of their freedom and equality and their dignity and rights. The current state of affairs in this COVID-19 world of ours, unfortunately, provides an opportunity for such actors to renew or increase their human rights violations. However, we are not just talking about governments and political leaders putting growing limitation on media, civic space, and freedom of expression, but also ordinary people's daily lives. To mention just one example, the UN has warned that gender-based violence, particularly in the home, has surged around the world as COVID-19 lockdowns became necessary. Gender equality has for a long time been a policy priority for us in Iceland, both locally and internationally. We strive to put gender equality at the top of the agenda wherever we speak. We are therefore very proud of the fact that Iceland was recently chosen to lead one of the action coalition of the Generation Equality initiatives, and we are looking forward to the challenge of leading from the front on that important initiative. Overall, my response to the challenges we face is simply this: we must redouble our efforts to safeguard and strengthen human rights, not allow the present vacuum to fester, given everyone's preoccupation with fighting the virus. Iceland will certainly continue to be a vocal advocate for human rights. During our recent membership of the UN Human Rights Council, we spearheaded the first joint statement on the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. We also put human rights violation in the Philippines on the agenda of the Council, an important initiative given the serious situation there. We have been vocal on recent events in Belarus, the assassination attempt against the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, the weakening of LGBT rights in Hungary, and on civil rights and democracy in Hong Kong. And we will remain committed to the cause of freedom and democracy everywhere as we go forward. The Nordic countries have a unique voice and are in a unique situation to be advocates for human rights, civil liberties, and democracy. Our ideals and our solidarity are and will be key to our success. Our reputation is solid and respected around the world, and we must use that. We should be even bolder than we are to call out those that violate human rights around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Iceland was until this year the smallest country to be elected to the Human Rights Council. But the power of your advocacy and the wisdom of your words has nothing to do with the number of your citizens or the size of your country. The only thing that matters is if you have something to say that needs to be said, and if you can bring others along with you. In that sense, our recent initiatives have made me very proud because it has been very clear that our voice has been heard. I can only hope it has inspired other smaller countries to stand up for human rights, because we need human rights champions of all sizes, big and small. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Thordarson. And with that, I turn to Oslo and invite State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Marianne Hagen, to make your intervention. Please.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me also thank Sweden for this timely initiative and for giving me this opportunity to share some reflections. First, I will highlight how the pandemic affects different groups differently and amplifies the challenges for minorities and already marginalized groups. Secondly, I will raise some of the dilemmas caused by the increased flow of dis and misinformation related to the pandemic. In recent months, we have witnessed how vulnerable democratic principles are in times of uncertainty and crisis. We've seen examples of the pandemic being used as a pretext to increase government control at the expense of rule of law and separation of the powers. We have also seen how unfairly the virus impinges on our people's lives. The consequences are far worse for persons belonging to minority groups, the poor, the homeless, and other vulnerable groups than of those belonging to majorities who are in good health and have safe jobs. This reminds us why a competent, independent, and impartial judiciary is the core of democratic principle. To ensure that minorities and other vulnerable groups have the same access to justice and protection of their fundamental rights, even during a crisis. The checks and balances of a democratic system is based on the rule of law, ensures that measures in a crisis are necessary, proportional, and legal, and without discrimination. In this regard, I would like to commend Secretary General Burrich of the Council of Europe for preparing a toolkit on respecting human rights, democracy, and the rule of law during COVID-19 at an early stage of the pandemic in Europe. COVID-19 affects girls and boys, women and men differently. While women make up 70% of the world's healthcare providers, women's own access to health care is heavily affected, not least access to sexual and reproductive health services. with devastating results and increases in maternal deaths, teenage pregnancies, and child marriage. The increase of violence against women and girls documented by UNFPA during the pandemic is shocking, with estimates of millions of additional gender-based violence cases as a result of continued lockdowns across the world. Human rights defenders also become more vulnerable in a situation where physical meetings, travels, etc. cannot take place. And the world's attention is directed at the pandemic's health implications. We have even seen cases of extraordinary measures being targeted to curb critical voices. Several dilemmas have become more prominent in the light of COVID-19. One of them concerns limitations in the freedom of speech and access to information, often motivated by an increased flow of dis- and misinformation related to the pandemic. Full transparency and access to reliable information from day one is the crucial aspect in stopping the spread of contagious diseases. Lack of transparency, on the other hand, inevitably leads to the lack of knowledge and lack of trust, and may cause indecisiveness and inaction, and ultimately loss of lives. Therefore, it is more important than ever that we join forces to fight disinformation while supporting independent journalism and freedom of speech. Algorithms in social media are reinforcing the spread of misinformation. This means that we all, as individuals, have a responsibility not to contribute to the dissemination. We need a collective push to increase public awareness. Let me conclude by reiterating that first and foremost, COVID-19 has reminded us of how important the multilateral system is. Well-functioning institutions at national level are vital in order to deal with the situation domestically, but COVID-19 is a global challenge that can be solved only through global cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam State Secretary. With that, we will turn now to representatives of international human rights organizations. And first, we will have a video greeting by the international community's top representative in the defense and promotion of human rights, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet.
Thank you for inviting me to speak on this vitally important topic. With some governments mobilizing trillions of euros to address and recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, the decisions they take today will have consequences for decades. At such a time, neither governments, their peoples, or our planet can afford to lose the perspective of human rights. With COVID-19, a fast-moving health crisis has met a series of slower, deeper social and economic crises generated by discrimination and inequalities, as well as a long-term erosion of democracy in some countries. This collision is resulting in a massive and multifactorial human rights crisis. Globally, we are seeing negative impacts across the entire range of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. But in some countries, we're also seeing evidence that human rights-based systems, such as social protection and universal health care, which act to shield the poorest and most vulnerable from at least some degree of harm, are ensuring greater hope of recovery. We can also see that some decision makers, including in the Nordic region, have made sound choices that have helped to uphold human rights. Others have used COVID-19 as a pretext to shut down criticism and protest. Everywhere, to a greater or lesser extent, the COVID-19 crisis has disproportionately affected the poor, indigenous peoples, marginalized or discriminated communities, migrants, people with disabilities, children and women. In other words, it has hit the disempowered, people whose voice is frequently ignored. This crisis is far from over. As we face its next phases, we need to learn from what went right and wrong in recent months. To me, the first lesson should be this. In order to navigate this pandemic insecurity, we need more empowerment, more democracy, more participation by civil society, not less. We need to build up human rights-based systems to protect and cherish the people, who are the greatest resource of any country and the only bottom line that really counts. And this crisis has again underlined the importance of the key structures of democratic governance, such as oversight institutions, which keep governments accountable for their actions, including emergency measures, free and independent media, which enable accurate feedback and evidence-based information saving lives, and the broadest possible civic space. We need to face the coming challenges with policies that are grounded in human rights and the principles of democracy and rule of law, so that we can minimize the devastating social and economic consequences of COVID-19 and build back societies that are resilient and fair.
Now I turn to Strasbourg and invite the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, Maria Pejcinovic-Buric, please, to make your intervention.
Thank you, Ambassador, and from my side, from Strasbourg, thank you very much for this timely initiative to Minister Ann Linde, and also for the very respective colleagues who are around the table, virtual table today. So human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are the pillars upon which the Council of Europe is built. And I know that, from what we heard so far, that these values are shared by participants in this discussion. But even among the Nordic countries, the means of tackling coronavirus have varied. So we cannot be surprised by the diversity of responses across Europe. The Council of Europe's mandate is to work with national authorities and help them take measures that are both effective and in line with their obligations as member states. These aims should run in parallel. Yes, it is understandable that in unprecedented and emergency situation, they may be measures that encroach on people's freedoms. But the purpose of these restrictions should be to save lives, and the right to life and to equitable access to healthcare are human rights that the Council of Europe defends. And we have been clear about the limits. For example, new laws and other action must comply with national constitutions and international law. Also, democratic debate must be free. And there are rights contained within European Convention on Human Rights, from which there can be derogation or exception at all. The prohibition of torture and inhuman or degrading treatment, for one, which requires an adequate level of medical care for people deprived of their liberty. Across our organization, we have been proactive in supporting member states to achieve the right balance and clear that the current situation cannot be used as a means to silence those who are critical to government. In April, I published a toolkit, and thank you for Norway to mentioning it, to help authorities ensure that their COVID-related measures are efficient, but proportionate and limited in time. Our Venice Commission has spelled out some of the principles, conditions, and guarantees that should be maintained in, for example, conducting elections. And our monitoring bodies have been hard at work, not least those relating to the Istanbul Convention on preventing and combating violence against women and domestic violence. Many more women have been exposed to this during the confinement period, and we have sought to share best practice on the way authorities can respond. Women are not only group to have experienced challenges. LGBTI, Roma, and other minorities have encountered problems, and we are determined to uphold our principles to their benefit too. This sentiments will underpin a political declaration intended for our ministerial session in Athens later this year. But we are not waiting, we are acting, and it is positive to hear that the ways in which others are doing the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary General. And with that, we have a second video message from UNESCO Director General Ulrike Zolé. We have to apologize. The video message we received was a bit too long, so we will have had to cut it a bit short. Please.
Excellencies, dear friends, I am delighted to be joining you for this event today. I would like to thank the Swedish government for organizing it, and I'd also like to thank all the participants, the ministers of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and Norway, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, the OSCE, and the Council of Europe. The COVID-19 pandemic is likely to be a major issue for the foreseeable future. It has shown us how quickly some of our most fundamental values can be called into question. At UNESCO, our message is clear. We must never lose sight of our humanist principles, even when they need to align with health consideration. Since our organization was created in 1945, it has worked to defend human rights in all of the fields covered by its mandate: education, culture, the sciences, press freedom, and journalist safety. These are all different ways of working towards the same goal: building the defense of human rights in the minds of men and women. This ambition is central to UNESCO's standard-setting activities. It underpins our conventions on culture, like the 2003 Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage, the 2005 Convention on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. This text seeks to establish a legal basis for the freedom to think, the freedom to create, and the freedom to express oneself. Defending human rights is also our goal as we develop a recommendation on open sciences. By ensuring that the results of research are widely available, we're working towards health and development for all. The same spirit drives our work on the ethics of artificial intelligence. As we look to find the right balance between public health and privacy, an ethical framework has never been more necessary, especially given the increase in contact tracing applications. In this situation, there are some boundaries that cannot be crossed. This was the message publicly affirmed at the start of the crisis by UNESCO's International Bioethics Committee and the World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology. But we need to do more. The world needs a standard-setting instrument on AI, an instrument that will establish a global consensus for the entire international community, as UNESCO did for the human genome not so long ago. This is the purpose of the first global standard-setting instrument on the ethics of AI, which our member states have asked us to develop.
Now I welcome the European Union's Special Representative for Human Rights, Eamon Gilmore. Please.
Thank you, Annika, and thank you, Minister Anne Linde, and indeed all of the Nordic ministers for organising this important and timely discussion on the broader human rights implications of the pandemic, which unfortunately is still with us. From the beginning, the European Union has made it clear that respect for all human rights, for democracy and for the rule of law must be at the heart of the response to the pandemic. And that was reflected in the declaration issued by High Representative Josep Borrell, as well as in various articles, statements and interviews. The pandemic is itself a human rights issue as it relates to the right to life, to access to healthcare, to related access to reliable information and freedom of expression, and to the importance of civil society. The European Union has insisted on the centrality of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law as the pandemic has spread and intensified, with impacts, for example, on the most vulnerable, the disproportionate effects on women who are working in frontline services and many of whom are victims of domestic violence, on the deepening of inequalities, and on the extraordinary measures taken by many countries throughout the world. Worldwide, we are now facing the greatest level of state control over citizens' lives in our lifetime, as about 90 countries have introduced emergency measures, more than 40 have adopted measures that affect freedom of expression, almost 150 that affect freedom of assembly, and more than 40 that impact on rights to privacy. Against that background, I want to highlight 4 elements of the European Union response. First, the Team Europe package has now mobilized 36 billion euros for global solidarity, which includes supporting healthcare systems, economic survival and recovery, research for vaccines and treatments, and much more. Second, the European Union has re-emphasized and reinforced its commitment to multilateralism in the context of this crisis. A practical example is the additional financial support which the European Union is providing to the World Health Organization, as well as, of course, as our continued support for the UN systems, and especially the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and indeed our continuing collaboration with regional organizations. Thirdly, human rights, democracy, and rule of law form an essential part of our daily engagement with partners relating to the COVID crisis, as we pursue issues such as the release of prisoners, freedom of the media, the rights of journalists, support for civil society, and the protection of human rights defenders, and the necessity to ensure that the emergency measures that are taken by countries are proportionate, limited in time, and unwound as soon as possible. Fourthly, we are preparing for the future. Throughout this pandemic, we have been working on a new European Union action plan, which will take 5 years and will be supported by resources from the new EU multi-annual financial framework. Discussions on that plan are now in their final stages. The proactive implementation of this plan will equip us to address the many human rights issues which are emerging from the COVID crisis or which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. In many ways, COVID-19 has transformed our world and contributed to the erosion of democracy. Our challenge now is to transform it for the better and to defend democracy. Thank you indeed for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Eamon. And with that, I turn to Warsaw and the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Katarzyna Gardawchadze, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, dear ministers, dear colleagues, and thank you for having ODIHR at this very timely discussion. It is also a sign of support for our office at times when it faces unprecedented difficulties. The pandemic continues to expose underlying and explicit challenges to our democracies. Few of these challenges are new in our view, but the pandemic has disclosed them in an exponential way. They are destabilizing, disruptive, and test the social contracts in our region. The Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights was established to strengthen security in the OSCE region. A key component is our early warning function. We have analyzed the impact of state responses to the COVID-19 on human rights and democracy and published a report in July. In it, we identified practices, good and bad, weaknesses and lessons, and provided states with recommendations on how to address similar situations in the future. More than 1/3 of OSCE participating states declared official states of public emergency, and almost all others adopted emergency regimes of different intensity or other restrictive measures. While states introduced those measures, we witnessed derogations to the freedom of assembly and association, freedom of movement, right to liberty and to a fair trial, as well as rights to privacy, education and property, and many other human rights and freedoms. These derogations were sometimes proportional, but far too often not. In some states, checks and balances worked, and parliaments acted with resilience when governments tried to overstep their powers. But we have also documented many cases of the opposite. Some governments and parliaments adopted controversial laws or introduced contentious electronic surveillance schemes. Some granted governments extensive or non-limited powers, while others disproportionately limited the role of civil society. We saw that many of those arguing for human rights and proportionality were labeled as enemies of the state. In many instances, measures were introduced in good faith, but without realization of the consequences they brought. For instance, for women and for socio-economically weaker groups who have and continue to be disproportionately affected by this crisis. The same applies to conflict-affected regions. In short, the crisis increases suffering of the vulnerable, magnifies challenges, and deepens rifts. As a consequence, trust in our rule of law-based democracies has been damaged and resilience of democratic institutions weakened. This must be reversed, recognizing the challenges and rebuilding resilience transparently and inclusively. You may ask what states can learn from this crisis. And in our view, one lesson is fundamental. 30 years ago, the landmark Copenhagen document was adopted by the OSCE participating states. In it, one of the basic principles of government is to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. A big lesson from the pandemic is that this principle must apply during the crisis situation. It must, because when this is no longer the case, when human rights, rule of law, and democratic principles are undermined, the risk of conflict increases. We know it all too well. That's why we have to reverse this trend in our own states and elsewhere. We have to stand firm to protect what we have achieved so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you, OSCE ODIHR. And with that, it's time for the civil society perspective. Can I ask Ken Roth from Human Rights Watch to come in first, please?
Yes, thank you very much to Sweden for organizing and to all the Nordic ministers for joining this very important conversation. As others have noted, the coronavirus pandemic has become a new excuse for governments to undermine human rights. One extreme has been what Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban did. He literally seized dictatorial powers to rule by decree, ostensibly because of the pandemic. More typically, governments censor inconvenient information about the pandemic. Early on, they wanted to pretend that the virus wasn't really there or that there wasn't human-to-human transmission. That's what China did at the outset, even to the point of risking the lives of its own healthcare workers just to try to keep the extent of the crisis a secret. More recently, governments have censored critics of their own responses, such as healthcare workers who complain about inadequate protective gear. Now, the pandemic has shown the dangers of an autocratic approach to governing. Autocrats like to pretend that they deliver better. But in fact, what we've seen is that they prefer manufactured crises that they can then solve. But the pandemic is a real crisis. And undermining free debate or free access to information about a public health threat is a sure way to aggravate rather than solve a public health crisis. That's also, frankly, a big part of the motivation behind the Belarus protests, which are not only about the stolen election, not only about the violent suppression of the protests, but also about poor governance in the face of the pandemic. So what can be done? First, pressure is needed on governments that use the pandemic as a pretext for repression. With respect to Hungary, that means ensuring that the European Commission has the authority to condition certain European Union assistance on respect for the rule of law and democratic values, based on a qualified majority, not a single government veto. Regarding China, that means pressing for genuine access by the World Health Organization-led investigation into the early days of the pandemic. China has a history of cover-up with SARS and indeed with the first WHO mission in February. We have to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Regarding Belarus, That means making clear that we all stand with the pro-democracy protesters and that anybody who suppresses their demonstrations will face targeted sanctions. Now, there are three other quick points I'd like to make. First, it's not enough to provide development assistance. That's needed, I don't want to belittle that. But if you don't also address misguided policies at the same time, such as the censoring of healthcare workers, development assistance will be a mere band-aid on a festering wound. It won't solve the problem. Second, it's not enough to serve as a mediator. Mediation often takes a very long time, and ongoing repression polarizes the parties and undermines the prospects for successful mediation. Parties to a mediation should never have the right to demand silence about their repression from the mediators, and the mediators should ensure that they speak out as they mediate. Finally, even small countries can play a very important leadership role, spearheading a coalition that can make a big difference in places like the UN Human Rights Council. It was already mentioned by the Foreign Minister of Iceland that Iceland did precisely that with tremendous effect for the Philippines and also led on Saudi Arabia. Finland had very positive results leading on Libya. The Netherlands did the same thing for several years on Yemen, and Denmark is about to do the same thing with respect to Saudi Arabia. Simply voting the right way on other governments' efforts isn't enough. Every government has a responsibility on its own to take a leadership role on at least one country that is engaged in serious repression. And I hope that each government participating in this conference today will take that to heart and make sure that they too are leading on an important country. Thank you very much for holding this seminar and for having me here.
Thank you, Ken Roth from Human Rights Watch, for your messages. And with that, I turn to Nils Mužnieks of Amnesty International. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Excellencies, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for the opportunity to represent civil society, which is under growing pressure within Europe and beyond. Many human rights defenders, journalists, whistleblowers, and NGOs who have criticized government responses to the COVID pandemic have been targeted for repression. In the fight against a pandemic, they should be seen as allies, not enemies. Now, despite this shrinking space, we're inspired by the many brave individuals, especially young people who are willing to risk arrest and sometimes a cracked skull to demonstrate, organize, and defend the environment, their own rights, or the rights of the most vulnerable, such as migrants, LGBTI persons, or racialized minorities. Women defenders have been among the key targets of repressive government action, especially as they've sought to address spikes in domestic violence during the lockdown and to prevent attempts to undermine sexual and reproductive health and rights. Women have also been very hard hit economically as they're overrepresented in the informal sector, so they need to be prioritized in recovery. We welcome progressive changes in some countries to make rape laws consent-based, to enhance access to safe and legal abortion care, and to find creative solutions to support victims of domestic violence. Europe can't speak credibly externally if it does not get its own house in order. We have particular concerns about ongoing human rights and rule of law backsliding in many countries, but especially in Poland and Hungary, within the EU, but also in broader Europe, in Azerbaijan, Central Asia, Russia, Turkey, and of course, Belarus, where we're appalled by the police violence and torture taking place there. Europe cannot speak credibly if it allows the migrant tragedy on the Greek islands to continue unaddressed. Now, there's an urgent need for a strong Nordic voice on behalf of human rights defenders in multilateral fora. Within the EU, we urge you to make sure that human rights defenders are on the agenda at the virtual EU summit with China this month, and in the EU-African Union summit at the end of October. We also encourage you to stand firm on the deteriorating human rights situation in India and Egypt. It's time to bring a commitment on defenders to the highest level at UN fora, within the EU Foreign Affairs Council, and through strengthened national and regional guidelines on human rights defenders. We need you all to rapidly pick up the pieces at the OSCE and agree to new leadership of its institutions, and to push for full and rapid implementation of judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. You're already champions of gender equality, but you need to lead the way in ensuring that international cooperation and assistance in strengthening healthcare is gender responsive and human rights compliant. You can help show that human rights are the solution and the guarantee of a just recovery for all, especially women and girls. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Niels Mužnieks from Amnesty International. And with that, we have concluded the round of interventions. And now I open the floor for a discussion. We have an audience with us that have and are sending in their questions to the participating representatives, ministers. Can I ask participants first if anyone wishes to comment on what was said by the other participants in this conversation? If not, I suggest to kickstart the discussion by turning to my colleague Johan Hallenborg, who is following the inflow of questions to the ministers and the panelists. Over to you, Johan.
Thank you, Annika. There is a lot of activity in the inbox. The first question is from Sebastian Anjou, and it's about the country situation. It's about Hong Kong. He writes about the new security law in Hong Kong, and he writes about many challenges for human rights. And his question is, what more can the Nordic countries do as being beacons of human rights to help restore the rights promised to the people of Hong Kong? So that would be the first question. Do you want me to take another one?
Yes, please.
We have a question of something quite different. This is about social dialogue, workers' rights, and respect for trade unions. This is a joint question from the Swedish Trade Union Confederations and their Organization for International Development Cooperation. And they write, the world of work is being profoundly affected by the global virus pandemic. We know that international cooperation and social dialogue with the involvement of employers and workers' organizations are necessary to reduce the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. And that the recovery process must come with a strong commitment to workers' rights, workplace democracy, and respect for trade unions. And the question is, how will the Nordic countries be at the forefront of promoting and ensuring social dialogue and respect for human rights at work as part of a global recovery based on economic participation, inclusion, and democracy?
Great. Thank you very much, Johan. So then let's start with the question on Hong Kong. Who would like to come in, please? Now I will have to turn to the screen. Yes, Ken Roth, please.
Thank you. I'm glad for the question on Hong Kong because we have a real problem with China. I mean, not only is it undergoing the most severe repression in recent history, not only in Hong Kong, but also in Tibet and Xinjiang and really across the country, but it also has basically enjoyed impunity for this. It is never criticized by, for example, the UN Human Rights Council. A number of mainly Western governments have come together to speak on the sidelines of the council, but there's never been a formal resolution. There's never been a monitoring mechanism set up. And I think it's for that reason that we saw 50 UN human rights experts call for a special session on China and some kind of monitoring mechanism. And that call was just joined by 320 civil society organizations. So I think many of the governments represented in the room here favor this, but what's really needed is an effort to rally others around the world in support of this. It's going to take a real coalition building effort because we all are aware of the Belt and Road Initiative and the amount of money that goes into essentially buying off government silence. And it's necessary to resist this because China represents not simply a severe threat at home, but it's also leading efforts globally to undermine the international system of human rights. It's time to do things differently, not to accept business as usual, to end the impunity, and to build a global coalition that will begin to hold China to account.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roth. I think I saw Minister Thordarson wave. Am I right? Please.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, I think that this is a pure example of quite a big challenge, but and I think that the analysis of Ken Roth was quite accurate. In a certain circumstance like this, then we need a coalition, and we need to work together for obvious reasons I do not need to explain, because the urgency is there without any doubt. And if we are going to see some changes, it's need a unified effort, not only of the Nordics, but we also need other countries to follow. But as has been mentioned, we need to be a beacon of the human rights, and this is something that we need to take seriously and do whatever we can, both together and in cooperation with others.
Thank you very much, Minister. Then I suggest that we move over to the second question on social dialogue. I think I have my Minister, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Ann Linde, who would like to come in, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Trade unions are actually severely hurt by the pandemic, especially because there are so many works that have been lost, and many of the health workers and social workers, who in 70% are women, are in precarious work and has difficulty when it comes to organizing and get the right to organizing. And I think that it's important that we both see this and acknowledge this. And what we have done also, that's not only for the pandemic, but that is the Swedish Foreign Ministry is writing human rights report on all countries and where we are. And now we have also told our embassies that there should be a section about trade union rights and the right to organize, to be able to publish that in an official report. And the first rounds of the reports were about Africa, where this was included. I also think the issue of social dialogue, as was mentioned in the question, is very important. We have an initiative that we call Global Deal, where we want governments, trade unions, and business to engage in a dialogue for inclusive growth and also the possibility to have both good for business and good for work and good for trade unions. And this is now headed by the OECD in Paris, where they have a secretariat. So for those who are listening and other governments and organizations who want to join, I really are saying that this is a very positive step that you can take in favor of social dialogue.
Thank you, Minister. I understand I have Minister Haavisto and then European Union Special Representative Gilmore. Please, Minister.
Thank you. Just actually to add what excellent answer that Ann gave to this issue, I just want to mention that when ministers are traveling, and when I was traveling previously as a Minister for Development Cooperation, now as Minister for Foreign Affairs, we usually try to meet the civil society in all locations, but not only ordinary civil society organizations, but also the labor union and workers associations and environmental associations. And very often when you meet these people and you ask what is the biggest problem in your country on the issues that you are working with, it's very often actually the freedom of expression issue. Very often when people speak about the environment, the first issue is about freedom of expression. When you speak about the labor rights, it's freedom of expression. And I have to say, for example, in the past years when visiting Turkmenistan and asking Turkmenistan government, could we meet with your civil society, they really one night before had actually made legal some of these associations just to give the opportunity for us to meet them. And I think this kind of pressure is also very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Eamon, please.
Yes, thanks, Annika. Well, just to add what the two ministers have said, long before I was the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights, or indeed involved in political life, I was a trade union organizer. So this is an area that interests me very considerably. Ever before the COVID crisis, I think we already had a big issue about the changing nature of the world of work and the degree to which employment is becoming more and more precarious, the degree to which trade union organization is very limited, the consequences of globalization for trade union organization and for collective bargaining. But I think that the COVID crisis has accelerated the problem. Issues relating to some sectors of the economy which have been very badly impacted, the advent of working from home, many changes in the employment situation. So therefore, I think this is an area that will require a lot of attention as we emerge from the COVID crisis. And I'm glad that the Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, the European Union Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, which I mentioned earlier, has for the first time a very substantial section on business and human rights, which is not just about the supply chain, it is also about issues relating to the rights of people at work and the rights of workers. And it is an area that I hope and expect that we will be working very closely with the International Labour Organization, for example, in the period ahead, because I think this is going to be one of the big issues emerging from the crisis.
Thank you very much, Eamon. And I understand that we have State Secretary Marianne Hagen, who would also like to comment on this question. Please.
Thank you. I also believe that this is one of the major questions we have ahead of us. And as we are building back greener and better, we must make sure that we are doing so in compliance with the UN guiding principles for business and human rights and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And we must not waver in our demand for responsible business conduct by all actors. And it is very easy to see that a lot of workers across the globe will not be in a position to negotiate their own rights. And a lot of enterprises and small and medium-sized businesses will be more or less desperate to get their business back on its feet. So this will be a major challenge. And also in coping with that challenge, I believe we need to have an even closer relationship with civil society to make sure that we have our ears on the ground and get all the information that we need about the situation around globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary of State. That concludes the discussion around human rights in the world of work. And then I'll turn again to my colleague Johan, who is monitoring the inflow of questions. Let's have another round of 2 questions, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you. We will move to Latin America. There's a question from Lina Amaya. What are the Nordic countries doing to contribute to the elimination of racism in Latin America? And how are we supporting the rights of women and the elimination of violence against women in Latin America? So that would be the first question. The second question would be regarding Zimbabwe. And this is from Martin Nilgård here in Sweden. He writes, in Zimbabwe, human rights are being violated more every day. Can the Nordic countries take lead for stronger diplomatic pressure on the Zimbabwean government? Maybe in partnership with South Africa, which is central in the context. And Martin also asks how Sweden can work more broadly with the drive for democracy under these circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. I look to our participants. Any volunteers? Yes, Minister Haavisto, please. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I think that here are much better experts on Latin America issue, but of course I want to generally mention that situation in Venezuela, of course, is something that as EU ministers, we are following very closely what can we do in this situation. And this is also linked to the COVID-19 crisis, that when you have a country that is, so to say, in a situation that a lot of people are leaving the country as refugees, and then those societies that are receiving the refugees maybe cannot take care of all the refugees, and particularly in the COVID-19 situation, this is a big trauma, of course, for in the situation there, but also then influencing us in Europe. A big amount of the refugees are coming, unfortunately, from there to Europe. This is something that we are working daily and weekly basis. And then I just make an indigenous people and indigenous groups I mentioned many times here, and I was personally involved in Honduras in Berta Cáceres case and followed the court in Tegucigalpa and with all those movements that are supporting not only Berta Cáceres but the rights of the Lenca Indians and so forth. And I think it's I was the only foreign observer there, and I just felt how much the indigenous people appreciated that somebody follows these cases and is publishing news about these cases and so forth. And also the EU embassy actually in Tegucigalpa was extremely active and recognized for its good work for the human rights. So I think we could and we should be more active on human rights issues also in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Haavisto. Any other voice on, in general, about violence against women? No, I then suggest that we turn to the second question, which pertained to Zimbabwe, with an add-on on the Swedish drive for democracy. So perhaps I can turn to my own minister. Please, Madam.
Yes, the last part of the question about what we can do via the drive for democracy, I take that challenge because I think it would be great if many more countries join, and I will take just a few examples. For example, in Harare, our minister in Zimbabwe, our Minister for Development Cooperation held digital discussions with journalists around the country about human rights, the media freedom and democracy. We also had in Sudan, where Sweden and UNDP organized discussions that was more than 2,500 youth engaged in discussion on how to democratize the country. Another example is our embassy in Amman, who collaborated with the biggest TV channel in Jordan, who recorded 3 panel discussions like this we have now, and then send it on prime time, well, shorted. They made it short, but anyway, in prime time on Jordan TV. We also have had in Addis Ababa about the effects on women and girls and the role of civil society in Africa. And in Peru, we have worked with the private business company to how can we work against corruption and sustainable business practices. And also in Asia, we have had a different meeting in Seoul. I participated myself together with South Korea and Australia on how we could develop democracy in an Asian context. And finally, also difficult country, we had 2 democracy talks organized in Phnom Penh on gender equality and how we can support women in democratic institutions and organizations. So I hope that we can inspire each other with different kinds of experience on how to broaden these democratic discussions with different actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Anybody else who would like to come in on this point on Zimbabwe? If not, I know that we have more questions. So, Yuan,
There was someone.
please.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I hear now that Marianne Hagen would like to come in again. Please, Madam State Secretary.
Thank you. I could not let this opportunity to say something about the women's situation in this pandemic and also in a human rights perspective pass without grasping it. As I said in my intervention, the increase that is reported on the violence of domestic violence and the worsened situation for women and girls during the pandemic is shocking, also in Latin America. And I believe that we need to, for us, one of the ways we can work is, as we all are major donors, we can make sure that when we donate money to the UN efforts or the ICRC efforts in a humanitarian crisis, that we make sure that the gender perspective and the human rights perspective is taken care of and is part of what we demand. And I think that is very important. We also have to, when we have our dialogue with other countries, we also have to make sure that women's access to sexual and reproductive services are also taken care of, that they actually have real access on the ground for that. So this will be one of the major issues for Norway as we will take our seat at the Security Council in January. And we're really looking forward to working on this issue, and we will give special priority to efforts to prevent and combat sexual violence in conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I understand also, Eamon, you would like to come in on this point?
Well, just a very quick point in relation to the issues raised about racism and women in Latin America. And I want to thank Minister Havisto for the kind remarks that he made about the European Union delegation. I think it was in Honduras. Of course, all of our European Union delegations and the embassies of our member states are very active on these issues in Latin American countries. But just to say that those particular issues have featured very high in the dialogues that we have with Latin American countries. And in dialogues that I have conducted myself over the course of the last year with Mexico, with Brazil, with Colombia, with Cuba, there are others planned. These have been very, very high on the agenda. The issues facing indigenous peoples, the discriminations that they are facing, the huge problem, huge scandal of femicides in some Latin American countries. And these are two areas where in a number of these countries, we've talked about doing some work together between the EU and the human rights institutions in the countries concerned to address these issues.
Thank you very much. Time is flying. I know that both Ken and Niels would like to come in on this point, but I'd very much like to squeeze in one last question on a rather burning topic. So, Johan, over to you for the last question from our audience.
Well, the question that has come in as we have this discussion is about Belarus. And it's quite straightforward. What are the Nordic countries doing in this very challenging situation in Belarus, and how can the democracy be promoted and human rights respected?
Very well. I see Minister Havisto and Ken Roth and Minister Thordarson. Very well. You have 1 minute each then. Thank you.
I know that Minister Ann Linde will certainly tell what Sweden as a coming presidency of OSCE can do and will do, and we give full support to the role of the OSCE. But we have seen already actually our ambassadors and representatives to protect the Nobel Prize winner in Minsk, and we had excellent. I just want to tell that we had an excellent visit last November with Minister Linde, which shows actually how we Nordics work together. We were together in Minsk and met even President Lukashenko, who told that he wants to follow the Nordic model. We said that it's an excellent model, but what about canceling the death sentence and start with that to follow the Nordic model, and we discussed about the free and fair elections, what these demand and how actually the OSCE and the ODIHR should follow the elections. Unfortunately, none of these advices or results of the discussions were followed, and we are in a crisis situation. And now it's very important that we protect the demonstrators and try our utmost to get the dialogue between the civil society and the government for the peaceful gains in Belarus.
Thank you very much. And then over to Ken Roth, please.
Just a few quick points. I think it's very important, as was just said, for the emphasis to be on supporting the protesters, to ensure that they are part of any dialogue. The dialogue should not be between the European Union and Putin, or the European Union and Lukashenko, but it should be between Lukashenko and the protesters. Second, we don't want just a kind of an orchestrated transition where there's a Lukashenko clone who comes in. The protesters want free and fair elections. That should be the demand, along with an end to the persecution, an end to the abductions, an end to the torture. And finally, the clear procedural step right now is for the so-called Moscow mechanism of the OSCE to be invoked. This simply takes 10 member states of the OSCE to demand it. And this would then send an investigative mission to Minsk in order to clearly investigate on the behalf of the international community the ongoing repression. So these are a number of very concrete things that I think Nordic governments and broader European governments can do.
Thank you, Mr. Roth, for being so brief. And now over to Minister Thordarson. You have one last minute, please.
Thank you. What I hope we are doing, that we are showing a support to the people of Belarus. I think that's the most important thing. And also that we are giving the clear message that the violence has to be stopped. And I think that we are doing everything we can at the moment on diplomatic terms to find a solution similar to those who have been mentioned here before me. But I think, I think actually it's a good example of how we are working closely together to try to achieve good and important things.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I know that Minister Linde would like to address this point as well. She will include it in her concluding remarks. It's time to wrap up this session now. So I will now thank all the audience and participants for being with us and hand over to Foreign Minister Linde for her concluding observations. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Annika, and thank you very much, colleagues and all the participants. I think these discussions are very useful, and I also think it's something that is listened to in other among the public and organizations, so that they get an impetus of discussing democracy themselves. That's why I think it's more important than, I'm sorry, I should look here. That is more important than just we talking to each other, but to get this out. But I have to say a little bit about Belarus, because the question also, and just as my dear Finnish colleague said, the two of us went to meet with both Lukashenko and trade unions and LGBT organizations and opposition parties and so on last year. And I still believe that there is a possibility for dialogue. And that is why we have an offer from the chair of OSCE Albania and the incoming chair of OSCE Sweden to help to facilitate a dialogue between the government and opposition. But at the same time, we need to be very clear on our demands that all political prisoners has to be released, that there should be no violence against peaceful protesters, and that is not acceptable that the people in the Coordination Council is being detained or forced outside the country. And to have these demands is not in contradiction with wanting to facilitate a dialogue. And I think that OSCE is is the organization that could make this possible, because that is not outside interference, since Belarus themselves are member of OSCE. Right now, it seems like it's not the possibility for a dialogue, but our offer stands, and I hope that it will come to a situation where it will be possible. I have also listened to what you have said in all your intervention, and my conclusion is that, of course, the work is far from over, and we must continue to safeguard the democracy and human rights in the wake of the pandemic, and despite the current circumstances, we must make sure that platforms are for accountability are upheld, and we spread this discussion. We can only do this together. We work very closely with our Nordic colleagues. We also advocate the importance of multilateral organizations and civil society. It's also a bad sign that multilateralism is weakened, that some important actors are withdrawing from multilateral organization. My government will, of course, continue to focus on the cornerstone of democracy, the democratic institutions, the freedom of the media, freedom of expression, civil society, equality, rule of law. And as I said earlier, it's very important that we don't forget this when we respond to the challenge of the pandemic. As I said, we are the incoming chair of OSCE, and we will put freedom of expression and freedom of media as priorities, as well as strengthening the democratic processes and increasing the civic space, promoting human rights, democracy. The OSCE is also a very important organization for accountability. So with this, I would like to thank my Nordic minister colleagues, to our invited guests, and finally, thank you very much all of you who follow this event online and for your questions. And even if we didn't manage to answer all questions, there were many more questions sent in. I hope that we can, in different forums, continue our discussion on democracy. Thank you very much, and have a nice weekend.
Thank you, Madam Minister. I hereby close this session. Thank you all, ministers, representatives, and civil society organizations, and not least the audience, as my minister just said. Please follow Sweden's work on the Drive for Democracy under #DriveForDemocracy. Thank you.